Gotcha. Awesome. All right, well, good evening, everybody. So welcome to what over the last 4 quarters, roughly a year, has been called our Sunday School Quarterly Teachers Intensive, and we are hosting it in here tonight. I'm not sure if that's going to be kind of the permanent drift of our plans, but of course this opens up the forum to more than just teachers, and lay members of the church are invited to come in and listen to. So, of course, with that, a couple of disclaimers, maybe house cleaning rules up front. Part of these conversations are going to be predicated on what's come before, but please don't think that you're already at a disadvantage, and don't let this make you feel intimidated or that somehow you might be lost in all of this, because while we are incrementally building on what we've talked about, much of this is repetitive, and you'll see why, and so you will be very easily able to pick up in these conversations that we'll be having tonight. And of course, this is entirely interactive. I know, even though this isn't the normal fellowship hall spread, please, as much as I can see you with the light shining in my face, should I notice a hand go up, please ask questions. I would be more than happy to clarify anything that I've said, or just discuss openly something that is of curiosity or interest to you, or by all means, please feel free to make a statement. Everything that's going to be quoted for you here is coming from the CSB because, of course, as a church, that's pretty much what we're using with respect to our Sunday school material. Now, what our intent tonight is to do exactly what you see here. If you have your handout, this is copied for you verbatim on there. And of course, the slide deck, we attempted to try using a QR code to make this available, and because of my technological ignorance, I wasn't quite able to make that come together. So if you want the slide deck for this, teachers normally have this printed out, ready for them to go when we all show up together. But if you want the slide deck for this, Brother Richard has graciously agreed to make that available, and he'll let us all know how that's going to happen as we conclude here tonight. One more thing, round about the 5-minute till mark, if I can catch that, with the multiple time sources I have up here, I will attempt to try to stop, give us all a chance to stretch our legs and take a break, but please get up and walk out at your leisure. You're not going to be disrupting anybody with respect to that. So back to what we're going to be accomplishing tonight. As Richard and Bart both called this the fall overview, my teachers are aware of this, but for anybody else that hasn't been exposed, the intent or goal tonight is not to teach you everything lesson by lesson that's going to be coming to you. If I do that, I've basically disarmed your teachers of just about anything that they would be sharing with you on Sundays. Not to say we could comprehensively cover it all, but it's not to steal their thunder, nor is it me taking the opportunity to try to teach the teachers what they should be teaching. But if anything, this is something of a collaborative effort on our part to try to help give teachers a little bit of a deeper insight as to some of the big biblical themes that are operating under the currency of what we're seeing on the actual page itself when we look at the text. And that serves kind of a twofold purpose. Part of that is enriching the teacher's understanding as much as it is mine in studying and preparing for this, and equipping them with a little bit more information to come into this with and look at things perhaps that they haven't seen before. And another thing, too, is allowing the teachers to do the teacher thing as goes teaching you how to be able to read and understand the Bible better, freeing them up perhaps, should any of them feel pressed by the burden to give pastoral application during their teaching time to you, because Bart's going to be, for the most part, focusing on the same text. And so if that frees us up to be able to teach you some of those deeper things and prepare you for what's going to come right after that, a few minutes later when we dismiss from our classes, we flood in here, we sing together, and then after that, Bart stands up and begins to deliver his sermon. Some of those things are perhaps already bouncing around in your mind. A good point would be just a couple of weeks ago when he was referencing the author G.K. Bill and I'm assuming this is the book he was probably referencing with respect to the temple, the church, and its mission. Probably the seminal work on all of the comparisons that he makes with respect to the temple and, again, its association with the church, Christian theology and its mission and so forth. But if that piqued your curiosity, these are the kind of things that we've been talking about in these seminars now for a year. And so if we're sharing these things with our students and you're letting your teachers know that you have deep interest in these things, you encourage them to want to bring these things out, because sometimes teachers can get a little bit intimidated to get nerdy with the biblical text because we don't want to go too far over our students' head, but we certainly want to raise their curiosity levels and challenge them. Then this is what this is geared for. So it's not to just give you everything that we're going to be talking about In fact, a lot of what you're going to hear me say tonight is not even going to be mentioned in any of our lesson material that we're going to be focusing on, because just to give you a real quick 30-second, 35,000-foot overview, with respect to the next 13 weeks, we're only going to be talking about 3 kings, 2 of them by name and lesson, Jeroboam and Ahab, Israelite kings, and then one indirectly, not really called out in the lesson title, but the lesson text deals directly with him, and that is Joash, a Judite king. And then for the rest of the texts that we'll discuss, they don't directly focus on any of the kings at all, but a lot of what I'm infusing into this material tonight is going to be heavily focusing on the kings, and that's to help you as teachers understand we need to be looking around the text that we are called to focus on to make sure that we're bringing extra material into it for the sake of helping our students understand the context and what's really going on here, okay? So with that, I'm going to do my best to try to relate each one of these particular slides as much as I can to a lesson it might fit in for you teachers to kind of get a better feel. Normally you have an outline sitting in front of you in which I've given you a cheat sheet for how I tie the slides into the various lessons, but I've built that into the slide deck this time, so you'll see that as we go. Anyway, this is the part of the Bible we're focusing on. You might not be aware of this, but books of the Kings, as was Joshua, Judges, Samuel, are all part of the prophets, so we have already been deeply immersed in the tradition of the prophets, even though we haven't gotten to a book that actually bears the name of a prophet yet. And that will come a little bit through the concourse of this semester, but we only have one more semester left for us after this one in the Old Testament, and that's where we're going to get a little bit more into the books of the prophets, but we're not going to get a chance to really dive deeply into any one of them, especially guys like Isaiah. We'll get a couple of Sundays with him. We get no Sundays at all with Ezekiel. So teachers, this is a chance for you to also start looking deeply into the words of the oracles of these prophets and draw inspiration when you're teaching on Sunday or getting ready to prepare for that, understanding that if you're looking ahead, you realize the shortchanging that we're getting with respect to the big major prophets, especially Isaiah. Take the time to study, see where it might actually apply to your lessons, all right? And beyond that, this is always our goal as teachers. We want our students to understand the biblical meta-narrative. We're trying to keep it at the 35,000-foot view as much as we can to see how these things connect with what's come before, emphasize the patterns, how they're being repeated. That's a lot of what I build into this so that we can appreciate for our students, get them to understand as much as we can with our assistance, the need for looking at this as it sets us up for the New Testament. And then once we're in the New Testament and we see these patterns play out, we realize how familiar that they have been to us all along. So these are the 8 things we're going to be talking about as we look into basically what I'm calling the descent into chaos, the decline of the monarch into exile. So if you've looked ahead, it won't actually call this out in a lesson title, but if you're paying attention to where the text itself ends in 2 Chronicles, which is the end of the Hebrew compilation of the Bible itself, we are going to be launching into the exile as soon as this quarter is done. One final quarter coming of Old Testament material that's exclusively prophets for the most part, and so after that, we're done. We need to be preparing our minds already, thinking through these themes, that by the end of these next 13 weeks, we'll have wrapped up Israel's period of the monarchy, and we will firmly be in the exile, moving through that to the final quarter of us being in the post-exile period. All right, so no further ado here. This is our first theme, Exodus. So this is where I would fit this. It's about as natural as it can be because our very first lesson next week is going to be focusing on what our lesson writers call Jeroboam's compromise. But one thing that I would draw out with respect to some of the theme that the author of Kings is representing for us is that Jeroboam, in many ways, is kind of being presented to us as something of a new Moses. And so on the left side of the screen, in the orange boxes, we're looking at the pattern as it's being laid out with respect to Jeroboam and the specific text from Kings that builds the case. And in the center side or portion of the slide, in the blue boxes, what we're understanding is how this parallels directly with Moses. So we see Jeroboam as the beginning of his story arc starts for us. He's coming out of Egypt. He is being called back to Israel, and part of that, of course, is to confront Solomon. Now, one interesting thing with respect to Jeroboam, if we've been raised in church long enough, we are keenly aware of the fact Jeroboam is the antithetical David as much as he is the antithetical Moses. And in every way, he is compared as the negative aspect or negative icon of all of Israel's kings as much as Judah's kings are compared to David. Did they walk in David's ways or did they not? Even though that's the case, one thing that we have to be careful of, and I challenge you to confront the temptation and avoid it, is to just immediately assume Jeroboam is a nefarious character as soon as we are introduced to him in the text. And I'm going to try to build that case for you here. But nonetheless, he's called out of Egypt. Think about that. If we're reading the Bible with a set of lenses on that helps us readily identify patterns, because at this point in the biblical text, traipsing from Genesis all the way to this point, we have seen many stories recycled again and again, many patterns and precedents laid down, and we see them repeated over and again. Now, granted, just because we see Jeroboam making a trip from Egypt all the way back to Israel doesn't necessarily mean that we should be automatically thinking Exodus, I suppose. But if we stack up the remaining points that come behind this, I think we'll see it clearly. Because as Jeroboam returns to Egypt, the reason why is because he has to face down a tyrannical king. Jeroboam doesn't come back as soon as Solomon dies. He is raised up as an adversary to Solomon to challenge Solomon. And part of the reason he's challenging Solomon is because of Solomon's tyranny and all of the measures of oppression that he has brought on Israel, that the tribes have all congealed there in Shechem, I believe, to face down his son Rehoboam and say, per the subject of our sermon this morning, either you fix this or we're leaving. So considering the fact that Jeroboam is having to face down a tyrannical king as he has come out of Egypt to do so, it starts to really beckon the idea that maybe we're looking at something like a new Moses or a rehashing of the Moses story arc. And of course, when Jeroboam shows up, he demands release from burden or else there will be judgment. In other words, you lighten the reins, or again, as I said, the tribes are going to ultimately rebel and you will lose the kingdom. And in a sense, Jeroboam becomes the deliverer, rescuing them from exile in Egypt. So what do I mean by that? Because most of the time I think when we're thinking about exile, we're thinking about Israel no longer being in the land. They're out of the land. But if we've paid any real keen attention to the book of Judges and the thematic sense of over and over again, we see these cyclical patterns of Israel receiving judgment from God, most of their privileges being stripped away. Nothing is happening the way it should with respect to them living in something of an Eden-like environment that Moses promised, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now they have oppressors like they did in Egypt coming into their own land and looting, pillaging, raping, taking exiles away and so forth. Even though they're in the land, it's almost like being under the most severe form of house arrest. And with respect to that, what does God do but raise up judges, deliverers, and so forth? So that pattern is being repeated here. And all of that, of course, is built upon what originally happened in Egypt. When under Joseph, we prosper. Now, with Moses here, everybody's experiencing the tyranny of this new Pharaoh. So, if we're paying attention now to the story of Solomon and how it went from where it was in 1 Kings 3 through 8 to now 1 Kings 11, it has drastically soured. Solomon has not only led Israel into egregious apostasy, but as the tribes are facing him down, or ultimately his son, and saying, either you reverse the course and loosen up the reins and stop oppressing us as you are, or else we leave, we are clearly back in the mix of Israel being in a new Egypt, but except they're in Israel. In a sense, it's exile because they are experiencing the oppressiveness of a king, albeit it's their own king and not somebody else. A new Pharaoh, his name just happens to be Solomon, and now that he's out of the picture, there's a chance for them to correct the course or not. But of course, we know that God is going to fracture the kingdom, and Jeroboam is supposed to be the guy that he's propping up to help lead them into a newer, brighter future. And we know this because of the very things that God says through his prophet Ahijah when he speaks to him and tells him, if you walk in my ways and do what I have commanded you to do, like my servant David did, I will give you all of Israel. You will rule over all that you want. It's not to make Jeroboam happy. It's to lead Israel away from what Solomon has led them into, to give them release from what Solomon has put them under. But sadly, he becomes something of an antithetical Moses. And in every way, he sours the relationship with God immediately, and it leads the people into far worse apostasy. As much as he is pictured as something of a deliverer like Moses, he, like Moses, oversees construction of sacred space, but it's not for worship of Yahweh, it's for worship of idols. In a sense, it seems to start out like it's worship of Yahweh, because he even decries the very same words that Aaron did when Aaron made the calf of all the gold articles the people gave him, fashioned it, and then put it in front of them and said, "Here is your God who led you from Egypt." Jeroboam does the same thing with the 2 golden calves he puts at the shrine in Dan and Bethel. It starts off with worship centered around Yahweh. In his lifetime, and certainly in subsequent generations and future dynasties, it is anything other than the worship of Yahweh. He even creates a whole liturgical expression of this. What I mean by that is setting up a calendar, feast days. He declares there's going to be feast days to come and worship at these particular shrines that he's erected. And of course, he ordains priests. And in fact, he ousts all the priests of Yahweh, and he specifically consecrates or ordains anybody who's willing to become a priest, as long as they are not from Aaronite or Levitical descent. And so Jeroboam, something of a new Moses, but again, we see this start to sour rather quickly. Now, why does this matter? I'll get to that here in just a minute, so let's put that on a Post-it note, hold that there for a second. Instead, let's look at this for a second. So what we'll also begin to appreciate is that David's rest slowly starts to chip away and becomes something of an exile. What I mean by rest is, consider what the ultimate goal of the Exodus is. If we're focusing on this as a theme, the goal of Exodus was to pull God's people out of Egypt into the promised space that he had already sworn to Abraham that was going to be theirs, unconditional promise. That's the end state. They go there, and when they go there, it's not for them to just simply spread out and to have a wonderfully blissful life. There is a purpose, an intent, an agenda there. God promises them Eden-like blessing, again, land flowing with milk and honey. See that pictured in the way Solomon rules over the people, everybody under his own vine and his own fig tree. But that's for them to be focused outwardly toward the nations, so that, per verse 3 of Genesis 12, what God's mandate to Abraham and his people is, that they will bless the nations, starts to come to pass. That's the ultimate goal of the entire phasic process of the Exodus. So now the people are in the land, and they have a king ruling over them, and he is supposed to be leading them in this direction. David was doing that. He gets to a certain point. Of course, he falls, but he does a pretty good job. He turns over a kingdom to Solomon that is in every way, sense, and form shaped for the people to now prosper. Because as much as Joshua had to spill blood, and then after that, God gives him and the people rest, this is exactly what is said of David. David spills a lot of blood, but when it's all said and done, God gives them rest on every side. And that word rest, in both Joshua's sense and David's sense, is supposed to go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, when at the beginning of that chapter, when God has finished creation in the preceding 6 days, now on the 7th day, he consecrates it, he makes it holy, he invites the man who he's put inside this garden and the woman he made from his side, who he's coronated as king and queen, and commissioned them as priests to enter in and enjoy his rest. And this kingdom of priests that he spoke about through Moses in Exodus 19, that are now living in this land under the prosperity that David has forged through blood, but at the same time through sincerity and worship of his God, and now turned over to Solomon, is supposed to now start reaching toward the nations. And for a while, Solomon does that. Emissaries come from all around. People are listening to what he's got to say. They're carrying that wisdom and those treasures back with them until Solomon commits apostasy. And sadly, in the center portion of that screen right there, you'll see this is the pattern that many of these other kings are going to wind up sadly succumbing to. So with Rehoboam, at first, when the kingdom itself fractures, Rehoboam is not left terribly disadvantaged. In fact, if anything, God shows an extra measure of grace to him seemingly by giving him many of the key leaders that were populating all Israel at the time. To illustrate my point, let's see if I have this verse actually attached here. No, I thought I did. I'm sorry. Anyway, to sum it up, though, what happens is as soon as this measure of fracturing the kingdom begins and Jeroboam starts to oust the priests of Yahweh, all of the Levites and priests who want to remain faithful to the Lord immediately leave Israel. And when they do, the people looking to them for guidance follow their example, and they flood into Jerusalem and all of the surrounding towns and villages of the now newly minted Judean kingdom. And with that, Rehoboam has way more people to not only rule over, but he has a lot of people to help prop him up and support him for the 3 years he remains faithful to the Lord. And so for that time, he seems to do what's right in God's sight until he doesn't. And then with that, God ultimately will bring Shishak, the king of Egypt at the time, to bring judgment upon him. And for some time, Judah is going to become indentured servants of this particular king. In fact, the very last verse of, it's chapter 12, verses 5 through 8 of 2 Chronicles. This is exactly what the chronicler has to say. When the Lord saw that they had humbled themselves, the Lord's message came to Shema the seer. They humbled themselves. I will not destroy them, but will grant them a little deliverance. My wrath will not be poured out on Jerusalem through Shishak. However, they will become his servants, so that they may recognize the difference between serving me and serving the kingdoms of other lands. And so rest is ultimately eroded away for the purpose of teaching them exactly what was supposed to be learned in the lessons of the people under the period of the judges. But sadly, they do not wind up learning those lessons. And we see that. I'm not going to read all these particular examples here, but starting from the upper left corner with Asa of Judah, coming 2 generations after Rehoboam, he is a king that in many ways starts out on the right foot. We don't get a lot of information about him from the books of Kings, and this is where I would encourage you, teachers, please, as much as Bart emphasizes this morning, look at the parallel accounts that are given to us in the books of the Chronicles. And the reason why I say that is because much of what the chronicler will say, if you haven't already noticed this, is going to greatly expand the circumstantial knowledge that we have of what's actually going on in the lives of these sons of David, because we focus on no Israelite kings at all with that. And some of the particular ones, such as Asa, we get a full 3-chapter rundown of what Asa started to do to prop himself up in following the Lord rightly. In fact, one example we get of this is in 2 Chronicles chapter 14, when he has to face down hundreds of thousands of soldiers that are part of a coalition army coming from Cush down in Egypt. But before they even fight this battle, because they turn to the Lord, God delivers them from that controversy. And after that, Asa begins to implement reforms, and he begins to try to turn the people toward following the Lord by tearing down high places and all of that. And in the beginning of chapter 15 of 2 Chronicles, this is what we see. The Spirit of God came upon Azariah, son of Oded. So he went out to meet Asa, and he said to him, Asa and all of Judah and Benjamin, hear me. The Lord is with you when you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you abandon him, he will follow you. And down in verse 7, he finishes this little speech up by saying, but as for you, be strong, don't give up, because your work has a reward. Maybe it was even possible in the days of Asa that there could have been a reunification of Israel under one king, the son of David, as promised per 2 Samuel chapter 7. But what winds up happening with Asa? The same thing that happens with many of these kings. He becomes puffed up in his own pride. There is a test or a challenge later on in the future, now having to do battle with the northern kingdom of Israel. And instead of him turning to the Lord, as he did with the Cushite invasion or the prospect of that, instead he takes the treasury in the temple, he empties it out. He bribes the king of Assyria to come down and take care of Baasha, the king of Israel at the time. And because of this, he gets reprimanded. All of this to simply say, not just giving you a history lesson of what's going on here. Every one of these kings are going to wind up repeating the same mistake of, instead of resting with the Lord, instead of doing, or I should say instead of being, they become way more focused on doing. And at some point in time, the foundations begin to crack, crumble, and erode. And instead of them perpetually, day by day, eating of the tree of life, they instead imbibe of the other tree that leads them to conventional wisdom, not the wisdom they should be following. And by virtue of that, they lose rest. And of course, all of Israel winds up suffering, or in this case, all of Judah winds up suffering for that. And it keeps them in this perpetual state of exile rather than leading them out of this through a new exodus and into a better age in which they are actually accomplishing the mission that God has for his people. There is seemingly a glimmer of hope, though, with this. In fact, if you pay attention to the stories of Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah, we kind of get a miniaturized revisitation of the actual story of the Exodus itself, the whole story arc, not just leaving Israel and then, leaving Egypt and then going to Sinai, but the whole thing from them going from there up into the promised land, and then ultimately what winds up happening per Moses' words in Deuteronomy, that I know you're going to turn away You just wait, it's going to wind up happening. And we see that again in the lives of Hezekiah, his son Manasseh, and then his son Josiah. Just to paint the picture for you a little bit, Hezekiah, when he becomes king, he removes the idols. He destroys the high places. Is this not what Joshua did after they wind up leaving Egypt and enter Israel or the land of Canaan? Absolutely. He leads Israel during a moment when Yahweh supernaturally defeats his enemies. We see multiple examples of this going on in the story arc of Joshua. We see that most poignantly at the moment when God made the sun stand still at Gibeon. Hezekiah repairs the temple just as much as Joshua in Joshua 18 erects the tabernacle now in the land to centralize worship so that no trace of idolatry or even beginning of idolatry can happen with Israel because they know they are supposed to come and offer there. He leads a united Israel, a remnant at least, in Passover. This is Hezekiah, whereas Joshua, of course, led the entire nation in an observance of Passover as soon as they crossed the Jordan River. And then lastly, he even entertains enemies under the guise of a ruse for alliance. And sadly, with Hezekiah, it was him being boastful to the Babylonians, which leads ultimately to Babylon gaining something of a foothold, ultimately leading to the exile, whereas with Joshua, it's the Gibeonites. We're all familiar with these stories. But Hezekiah, in a sense, is kind of like a Joshua coming into the land and making it presentable, operable for the people to start, gaining a foothold, establishing the presence of Yahweh in the land. Hezekiah is taking over for a wicked king, his father Ahaz, who was doing everything he could to remove all traces of Yahweh in Judah and the ancestry and the legacy that they leaned so heavily upon. Hezekiah is trying to restore that. Manasseh, though, steps up right after him, and wow, I mean, he's so much more worse than Ahaz ever thought about being. And as much as Moses was predicting in Deuteronomy that in future days you will wind up leaving the Lord, you will commit apostasy, and by virtue of this, God is going to do to you to what he is using you to do to the current inhabitants of the land of Canaan. In the days of Manasseh, we find in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, he did what was evil in God's sight, imitating the nations. That's exactly what Moses said they were to avoid. He rebuilt the high places that Hezekiah had torn down, the altars for the Baals, the Asherah poles. He built altars to all the stars under the sky, and in the Lord's temple. He passed his sons through the fire. He even practiced witchcraft. And what's unique to the book of Chronicles that we do not get from Kings is we actually have this picture of Manasseh going off into exile. The Assyrians actually come down and attack Jerusalem in such a devastating way that they capture Judah's king, Manasseh, and they cart him off by hooks up to one of their particular cities. And it says in, again, chapter 33, so he brought against them the military commanders of the king of Assyria. They captured Manasseh with hooks, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. When he was in distress, he sought the favor of the Lord his God, and he earnestly humbled himself before the God of his ancestors, and he prayed to him. And he granted his request and brought him back to Jerusalem to his kingdom. So Manasseh came to know that the Lord is God. So get that. Manasseh is not only carted away in exile, but he humbles himself, and then God restores him to his throne. And with that, Manasseh, for the final years he has, starts an effort at trying to tear down what he had built and lead the people back to the Lord, ultimately setting up the stage for Josiah to come. What difference does this make? Again, if we're looking at Israel's past, considering that Hezekiah is like a new Joshua, and that in the days of Manasseh, we have the 500-year period between Solomon and eventually the exile, in which both kingdoms, north and south, are slowly or at a rapid pace just running all out toward apostasy. It eventually ends in their exile. Manasseh is a picture of both of these kingdoms and Israel going into exile, but we know it won't end there. We know that there will be a new exodus on the other side of this exile, bringing the people back to the land. Enter now the days of Messiah. And Josiah, in a sense, is a picture of what that will mean. Because with Manasseh's repentance, deliverance, and restoration that symbolizes Judah's release from captivity, the land, through Josiah, is cleansed from idolatry, the whole land, not just the kingdom of Judah. He even goes above his borders to the north, to the remains of what was the former kingdom that his ancestors had ruled over, and at all of their sacred sites and shrines, he is doing everything he can to ultimately pollute and defile them, so now they have no place to worship. They have to come to the temple if they want to remain faithful to Yahweh. Torah goes from Jerusalem. He sends crews of people to instruct them on what it takes to obey the Lord. As Bart said this morning, they found the Bible in the church. And then he leads a remnant of Israel, those who were left behind from the Assyrian deportation and the people that are a part of his kingdom, in a united observance of Passover. Again, is this not a picture of what Messiah will do someday? That he will lead a unified Israel again through what Passover ultimately symbolizes, which is deliverance from exile through the last and final plague to new life on the other side of Exodus. And of course, Josiah, as much as Hezekiah does, and Hezekiah did what Joshua did, he covenantally binds Israel to following God exclusively, abandoning the prostitution of serving other gods. All right, I realize I'm going way too slow, so I'm going to have to speed up on this. There are occasional glimpses of Exodus here and there. I would fit this here at this particular moment because in 2 Kings chapter 2 and 4, we have this nice little tucked-in story in 2 Kings 3 where we have, of all people, Ahab's son, Jehoram, and one of Judah's righteous kings, Jehoshaphat, working together with Edom's king to face down the Moabites, who have now become a challenge to all three of these kingdoms. And I would take the time to go through the points, but except for the fact that it will bleed all of my time away, you can do this should you get the slide deck yourself. But all of this to simply say that we've got a few things here that certainly match up with the concept of an Exodus picture here actually happening. If you start to line the points up, what are we appreciating here? That in a sense, during the time of Ahab, the people are living under what appears to be an exile because, man, Ahab is just doing all he can to try to eradicate all of the presence of Yahweh and the worship of Yahweh in the land. His wife has declared open season on those prophets. They're hunting them down left and right. And poor little Elijah is doing all he can to try to continue to remain faithful to the Lord. But he's really taking it hard, too, with respect to the challenge and showdown against these particular people, wicked Ahab and Jezebel. All that to say, though, one thing that's quite unique with respect to the writing of Kings is that not always do we necessarily have the writer telling us what the person who is at the forefront of the story is doing is right or wrong. They really don't ever seem to weigh in on that. And more importantly, what we have with this particular situation is a picture of the Exodus almost turned on its head. And what I mean by that is while the story seems to be going in the right direction, with now two of God's kings working together with an Edomite relative as king to squash the Moabites who wants to threaten all of these kingdoms and turn them into slaves and so forth, they are winning the day. They have the upper hand and advantage in the battle. And then when they are pressing it against the capital city of the Moabite king, all of a sudden when that particular king sacrifices his son, God brings wrath upon everyone, including the Israelites. It's as if to say God turns this picture of Exodus on its head to where now God is bringing judgment into it. And the writer of Kings is giving us this story to show us what I've been talking about here. That the Exodus itself, the journey from Egypt into Canaan to make Canaan Israel, and from this newly declared Eden space to launch blessings out to the world for Abraham's people to influence all the nations and bringing them back to God is not working out. And this brief little picture of these kings fighting against each other shows exactly why that is. It's because of where their allegiances and loyalties wind up lying. And it's the writer's very unique and crafty way of showing us that the Exodus itself is somewhat stalled, and it's going to have to be restarted by somebody outside of either the sons of David or the kings of Israel. Now, if you're asking why all this matters, this is why this matters. I use this slide quite frequently because the theme of Exodus is so predominant in the New Testament. It's the very backbone, as you see illustrated there, on which all of the gospel writers, in one way or another, seemingly attach every single narrative aspect of Jesus' journey from not only his birth, but certainly the beginning of his public ministry until his death. And then when we go into what many call the fifth gospel, the book of Acts, where Luke continues his narrative, we see the conquering of the nations and the release of them from the bondage of sin through the last and final Exodus, away from the exile that damns all men to judgment and wrath, to eventually the life that comes and the new creation that comes on the other side of that. And we don't escape that there after we get out of the Gospels. In fact, the very last book of the entire Bible in the New Testament has so many things that reference the Exodus as goes the theme itself. So teachers, it's important for us to have a firm grasp on this theme as it reverberates in all of these sections in the Old Testament. Because when we get to the New Testament, if we do not prepare our students for understanding these are the things that we're automatically seeing as soon as we see Jesus being baptized, declared as the new Davidic descendant, meaning he is the hope of Israel now in leading them from this final stage of exile to and through the last and final Exodus. Man, we're selling our students short. So We have to make sure we're focusing on that. All right. Any questions out there on what I've spit at you so far about the Exodus? All right, so let's talk a little bit about Messiah. Here we're going to dive into the stories of Elijah and Elisha. We spend really 3 whole Sundays on this because when we start looking at Ahab's idolatry, of course, he's going to be confronted by Elijah, and we really don't have that story so much up front because we don't talk a lot about Elijah. We really just kind of skip past him and jump right into Elisha being brought onto the scene. But the reason why this is important is because if we're looking very carefully at the way the writer of Kings is orchestrating the lives of Elijah and Elisha, if we are familiar enough with the way the paradigm of the New Testament begins to play out, we'll start to see things that we're already familiar with. Now, I will caution, teachers, we always have to fight against the temptation to try to bring too much of the New Testament to bear upon the Old Testament and do what some Bible teachers of the past have done, and in this eisegetical way, that means reading into the text things that are not there, attempting to try to over-spiritualize the Old Testament in such a way that all we're seeing is the stories of the New Testament. But there are keen parallels that the original writers of these Old Testament stories are not seeing, they do not anticipate are happening, but the writers of the New Testament are perhaps stylizing their stories in such a way to bring the patterns of these sequences and these stories out for the sake of their writers or readers who they know are very deeply intimate with the Old Testament, will readily pick up on, hey, I read the story of Elijah or John here, the baptizer, and he really seems to look a lot like Elijah. Or Jesus, man, he really seems to parallel Elisha in a lot of ways. Let's just explore a couple of those points because Elijah, he calls Israel to repentance. He confronts Ahab and Jezebel. He even anoints Elisha as his own successor. Elisha receives the spirit of Elijah, and Elisha and Jehu, they ultimately work to destroy the temple, right? Well, we see these things play out somewhat in John's life because he will call Israel to repentance, the very thing that he's doing when we are introduced to him on the scene. He confronts his own Ahab and Jezebel in the form of Herod and Herodias for their wickedness, which causes him to lose his head. He baptizes his successor, that meaning as much as it was Elisha to Elijah, Jesus is going to be John's successor. And we might not readily see that, but when you consider the way the gospel writers portray Jesus as being there with John, maybe at a separate spot, but with John in the fact that he's unified in this effort, baptizing other people in the Jordan, and that's how he starts his ministry out. In every way and in every sense, he is John's successor. John shows up pronouncing the kingdom is going to come, and the one to whom that belongs is right behind him. The one to whom that belongs shows up, and he continues the message of the arrival of the kingdom. And ultimately, of course, Jesus is going to, as much as Elisha did with Jehu, predict the fall of the temple. And then we see parallels between Elisha and Jesus. I would go through that with you, but again, for the sake of time, I'll just leave that for you to explore as a teacher. Because moving on, it's not just Elijah parallels John the Baptist, but Elijah also parallels Jesus. And if that's the case, if John precedes Jesus, and now we're looking at Elijah as a Jesus figure, who precedes Jesus? But the disciples, obviously the apostles, but of course this legacy passes down to us, and this ultimately brings about why this matters. So Elijah, he passes through the Jordan. Jesus does the same thing. He calls Israel to repentance. We've discussed that. Yahweh speaks to Elijah on a mountain. I mean, this really should start to hit home with respect to our level of familiarity with respect to these New Testament stories. In fact, when Jesus is being spoken to by God on a mountain, who is right there with him to experience that? Two people. One's name's Moses. Take a wild guess who the other person is. Somebody? Spit it out. Elijah. Yeah, so I mean, that in and of itself is not to answer some cryptic question as to whether or not Elijah might have a role to play in the future. It is in every way to anchor us in these biblical stories that have already come at us. That Elijah has had not only a mountaintop experience in which he had the theophanic presence of God manifest itself to him, but now that presence is standing beside him as Moses also experienced much of the same thing at the very same site that Elijah did. So it's wrapping these stories together, which is making us as the story readers stop and pause and think to ourselves, what does this mean? So how does this fit into Messiah? Because this is what helps us build messianic theology. If our students are looking to us for those answers, and you might not think that they are, but in some way they will be, and wondering how is it that we come to recognizing what prophecies in the Old Testament uniquely portray Jesus, because sometimes they're not so easy, right? Of course, we can see something like Isaiah 7:14, behold, the virgin shall conceive, as being clearly what portrays Jesus as being the fulfillment of that particular prophecy. But what about Matthew's use of Hosea? Out of Egypt I have called my son. When and at what point did that start to take on messianic connotations? Right? Or when David penned the words of Psalm 22, speaking about the manner in which he felt like he was being oppressed and almost put to death by those people who were seeking his life. And of course, they didn't kill him because he continues to live to write many other psalms. But it's so prolific in the way that it describes the manner in which Jesus died. Was he just suddenly and ecstatically overcome by the Holy Spirit in such a way that he was writing about an experience completely foreign to him, but somehow in every way intimate to Jesus' own? No. What I'm saying is that many of these Old Testament messianic prophecies were not immediately messianic when they first come out and either are spoken or written and then preserved. Many generations will come to realize that because they were not fulfilled in the time of that particular person, and there still awaits a time of when a greater fulfillment must be coming on the horizon. And of course, when other prophets begin to take up both word and pen and speak to the time in which this Davidic-like king that's going to come and rule and reign over them, and uses all of these other word pictures that are familiar to other stories like Moses or even Elijah in that matter, we start to understand that this is where Messianic theology is ultimately rooted at. Oh, I don't have time to go over that, so I have to skip that. As always, I prepare too much, and this is the problem I create for myself. And as much as Elijah is John, Moses is an Elijah figure. So what we're really looking at here is Moses is Elijah, is John. So just think with me here for a second. Elijah leaves the land in exile, and that's exactly what he does. He doesn't stay there for the entire tenure of his prophethood. He winds up speaking prophecies and dealing with confronting kings and so forth, but then for a time, he winds up leaving the land. Moses ultimately leaves Egypt in exile. We're not talking about the time when he leads Israel out of Egypt. We're talking about after he murdered someone, tried to cover it up, and then spends 40 years out in the wilderness. And what about John the Baptist? What was he doing in all of those formative years before we see him dressed like Elijah, acting like Elijah, preaching like Elijah on the banks of the Jordan River? Probably living in exile. Why? Because he's a prime target of the Herodian dynasty. And I think Luke makes that clear. When Luke gives us the circumstances of his supernatural birth, whereas no other gospel writer does, he's calling our attention to the fact that there's something special about this guy. Not just the fact he's a messianic forerunner, but even in John's day, people are asking, are you the Messiah? And so from the days he comes out of his mother up until this moment, he has been a prime target for the Herodian dynasty who's trying to squash out all messianic usurpers or pretenders, right? So let's go further. Ahab, in his own right, in his story, is an oppressive Pharaoh. And as much as Moses has to address his own tyrannical Pharaoh, so is Elijah having to address this new tyrant who rules over God's people. And it's his way or the highway. You will either worship Baal or you can lose your head. You can either proclaim words of favor to the king in the name of his god Baal and serve as prophet or priest, or if you want to continue to worship the God of their ancestors, Yahweh, again, you'll lose your life, much as Israel was having to pay that price in Egypt. Ahab's son dies, and then Elijah leaves the land. What did Moses do the night when Pharaoh's son died? But he leaves the land. And then, of course, with that, we have John baptizing in Jordan. And it's not to say that all these parallels work exactly point for point, and I would explain that further, but for the sake of time, I'll move a little further here. If you want to entertain questions afterwards with that, I'll be more than happy to answer. And then Elisha, he ascends on the far side of Jordan. Where does Moses' journey end? But on the far side of Jordan. And what do we have with respect to John? His entire ministry is centered all around the Jordan until he's finally pulled in to one of Herod's palaces and stays his final days there in prison. And then we could run down the parallels too with respect to Joshua, is an Elisha, and is a Jesus. But let me instead close this section out with why this matters. It's not just for the sake of identifying that the pattern is repeated. So teachers, please understand that. It's not simply for recognizing that this is a pattern and it's there and we just give this really cool, super awesome Bible nerdy knowledge to our students. But instead, once the pattern is seen playing out in the New Testament, this very thing that we've looked at here, then what we are being called to do as the Bible readers and students is to re-immerse ourselves in the world, the environs of where those patterns have played out before, and see how the stories add value to what's happening here in the New Testament. In other words, as much as Israel under Solomon in his final days has become a new Egypt, considering he's a tyrannical Pharaoh, and considering the fact that Ahab has turned the northern kingdom of Israel into a brand new Egypt in a sense, and we consider the way that Moses-like figures like Jeroboam or Elijah have to face them down. And of course, the way that those stories may play out, Jeroboam and Elisha take two different trajectories. But what it's painting the picture of here is that instead of the people coming out of Egypt, it's like they continue to immerse themselves further into Egypt. Why this matters is because when we get into the New Testament and we have the birth narrative of Jesus in Matthew, and Herod wants to seek this baby out and kill him the way the Pharaoh of Egypt did during the days of Moses, Matthew is intentionally calling our eyes to focus on the fact that the Israel that Herod rules over at that time is a new Egypt. And this seems to be the legacy of Israel, that time and time again, they continue to want to reverberate back to this default position of being like Egypt. And Israel can't stay in Egypt. Israel has to come out of Egypt. And Israel requires a messianic figure to lead them from exile through Exodus and enter Jesus. That's exactly what the gospel narrative is all about. So, what should we expect to see play out in the later story? Playing on the pattern of the former, right? That's what we're trying to get our students to understand by identifying these patterns for them. All right, any questions on Messiah? Nothing? Don't want to miss any hands. All right, wilderness. So I think this ties in quite well with respect to what's going to come in the middle portion of our 13-week trek there, when the primary theme is a humiliated king, nation, people, and heart. And ultimately, with respect to the wilderness, I use a little fancy word there, liminal space. What we're supposed to understand is that the time spent in wilderness is really a proving ground for testing. It's a time in which God, either through positive, considering the exodus from Egypt and leading them into the wilderness, that's a positive circumstance. They didn't do anything wrong. God is intentionally leading them out of Egypt for the sake of eventually bringing them into Canaan well over a year after that fact. But during this time, God's going to harness the wilderness for the sake of proving them, testing them, revealing to them, because he already knows what's in their hearts, so that they can get some things worked out, learn to trust God, so that when they faced greater challenges and obstacles in the land, many of these things will be stuff they've already faced in the wilderness, maybe not on such a grand scale, but if God was faithful then, there's no reason to think he won't be now. So the basic pattern of wilderness testing is like this. A critical need arises. Could be food, could be water, could be a war they've got to face. Obedience to their calling is challenged. In other words, do you submit to the fact that you are my covenant people? That you have agreed to follow me, that you recognize me as your God, and by virtue of that, all of your needs are going to be met and supplied by me. You don't need to go anywhere else, but trust in me, because if you do, then I will use you for far greater things, right? Options are very subtly presented, but most of the time the options are to trust in Yahweh for these resources, deliverance, or again, provisions, or both. And of course, the option to follow Yahweh's Torah, to step up to the occasion and to do what is the premise of the original test in the garden. Every one of these tests echo the very story of the Garden of Eden. You've got two trees, tree of life or the tree of Tov and Ra, good and evil. Which one will you partake in? And of course, depending upon which one, it will either lead to life or exile and death. And a choice has to be made. Passing would be considered trusting in Yahweh, which again, life, prosperity, or failing, which leads to rebellion, exile, death. We have a very good pattern of this very thing set up for us at Sinai. The test is simply just waiting upon Yahweh, because God has told them the end of the journey is you going to the land flowing with milk and honey, and that's not Sinai. So when God calls Moses up to Sinai, God has already revealed himself to these people, and fire and smoke on the mountain. They hear his voice. This is not some apparition that Moses has made up. They hear his words, and they agree to be obedient to them. So then when God calls Moses up to the mountain, and 40 days later, per the Hebrew rendering of the story, they are shamed by this. It is a humiliating thing for Moses to be up on the mountain and making them wait for so long a period that now they're not even sure if Moses is still alive, and they come to Aaron and say, as goes this Moses fellow, we don't know what has happened here. Moses has called the people to obedience. God has spoken to them and said, you will have no other gods except for me. But what happens? In Exodus 32 at the base of Sinai, but they create another god to bow their knee down to. They make an idol. They pretty much break the entirety of the Decalogue or Ten Commandments in just that premise alone. And of course, the failure to obey, it's rebellion, and it leads to exile. Considering the fact that roughly 3,000 people that day were exiled to death. And then, of course, many scholars would go on to say that perhaps whereas the entirety of the nation could have been represented as priests in the sacred space of the tabernacle, now that's only given to the one tribe that stems up beside Moses and is willing to demonstrate their obedience. Point being, we see this happen so many different times throughout these stories. I'm just going to discuss that of Rehoboam since we talked about it today and it's fresh in our minds. The test, he is to follow the Lord as David did. And to revisit what I was talking about earlier from 2 Chronicles, he has all of these leaders come to him from Israel saying, we are willing to give up our lives, our possessions, our legacies in the lands that we've had for generations to come and be with you. Why? Because you are the last stem of hope. We cannot worship Yahweh up there. Jeroboam has forbidden it. So we are coming here because we hope to continue that faithful expression of Yahweh, or worshiping Yahweh in sacred space. And by that, we hope to find new life and new liberty through being delivered down here to live and dwell with you. Rehoboam could have taken this and ran with it, and his kingdom could have prospered beyond measure. I mean, consider the fact that during Jehoshaphat's day, Jehoshaphat greatly expands the territorial holdings of Judah, such that Judah and Israel are pretty much on par with each other for how much land and territory both kingdoms control. So God could have prospered Rehoboam way above and beyond what he was prepared to accept. So the options are quite simple. Be a man after God's own heart. Or you can strengthen yourself and consolidate power. So for 3 years, he walks with Yahweh. After 3 years, once he realizes he firmly has the kingdom established under his control, he books it. He jets in the other direction. And what does this lead to? Shishak invading Egypt. That's a form of exile, right? Because every bit of the opulence that was in the temple has now been stripped away and taken. And we'll see how that pattern starts to play out all the more with respect to how the temple seems to suffer every time these patterns begin to show up. So, last on wilderness, wisdom of God will only take me just a few minutes, and after that we'll take a 5-minute break. So just bear with me for a second, and we'll get through this. So, it's always the same 2 trees and the same old choice to make. Now, why is this important for us with respect to focusing on this as a theme? Again, you're going to have to be mindful of this, teachers, and focusing on the fact that you're only going to have a handful of lessons to really focus on kings that are going to be a part of the text your students are going to read. So I would highly encourage you to do some digging in the lives of these kings in both accounts of Kings and Chronicles and pull information from that and bring that into what's going on contextually with respect to these particular passages. Now, as I've crossed over the berm into a new particular theme, but I've not given you a slide to show you what lessons this fits in, I'm doing that because I still think this fits in right there in the middle portion of our 13-week breakout. So again, humbled nation, people, heart, and so forth. Why are they humbled? Because this is the choice they've chose to make, to not take of the tree of life, but instead the opposite tree. And as I said, and the reason why I've got this highlighted in or boxed in orange is because that's the preeminent pattern that's set for us, what happened in the garden. So what you're going to see in the green boxes there is the option that God gives. As much as it was a command from the Lord to the original image bearers, you can eat from any tree in the garden. Do not eat from that tree. The day that you do, you will surely die. God gives every one of these kings a very similar, let's not call it an ultimatum, but rather just a choice. And most of the time it's presented to them at the beginning of their tenure as king. Solomon, if you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and commands, just as your father David did, I will give you long life and all the things that you didn't ask for. But sadly, as much as God has to tell Adam and Eve they are no longer welcome inside the sacred space of the garden temple, so he winds up telling Solomon or I should say Jeroboam through Ahijah, that he's about to tear the kingdom away from Solomon's hand. And who knows? Part of the reason why Solomon had put a target on Jeroboam's back and wanted to have him executed could be because some of those words had made it back to him that Jeroboam was going to be the one to inherit Solomon's kingdom rather than a son after him. And this is even put to Jeroboam much in the same way, because Jeroboam is not set up as a fall guy. He's not some sort of patsy. Again, I would call you into challenging your own presumptuous view of Jeroboam before we start to just immediately assume he's a bad guy. Because if we immediately assume he's a bad guy, but then we listen to the words that God presents to him in 1 Kings 11, verses 37 through 39, I will appoint you, and you will reign as king over all you want, and you will be king over Israel. After that, if you obey all I command you, walk in my ways, do what is right in my sight, in order to keep my statutes and my commands as my servant David did, I will be with you, and I will build you a lasting dynasty, just as I did David. If God did not sincerely mean that, why did he offer it? Is it possible that Jeroboam could have done that? Absolutely, had Jeroboam chose to humble himself and submit to God's wisdom rather than his own. And because that does not wind up happening, what does Jeroboam do but lead them into apostasy? So the question we have to ultimately ask ourselves is, does God stink at choosing kings? Did God not foresee what Jeroboam was going to do? If he did, why in the world, if he really wanted a better future for the northern kingdom of Israel, did he choose such a horrific guy who was in no way, shape, or form ever going to step up into that challenge and do the right thing? Because it's an option. It's which tree are you going to take from? And we see how that plays out in Jeroboam's life. And the reason why this matters is because Joash, for you teachers, this is one of those particular lessons where we have a king pointed out to us. And of course, the whole central theme of that lesson focusing on Joash is why he's humiliated. And he's one of those kings that starts out quite well. He's the kid that was preserved all the way up till his 8th year of life, hidden in the temple from his grandmother that had all the rest of his brothers executed so she could be queen. And then Jehoiada, the high priest, brings this kid out to have him installed as king, as was his rightful legacy. And then, of course, with that, we have a brief period of revival that does last for several years up until the death of Jehoiada. And then, sadly, Joash decides to stop eating of the tree of life because no one's there to guide him anymore. And he foolishly runs to the tree of Tov and Ra. And with that, the kingdom experiences exile and death. So what does this leave us wanting here? But through every one of these stories, we are still waiting on what Moses had encouraged the people to get, to seek. The Shema of Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you are to love him with all of your heart and strength. But we'll also see that humbled circumstances, be it as they are in certain stories, always seem to lead us right back to the basics. And the two examples I give are that of Jehoshaphat. I mean, think about him. Granted, he is one of those few kings who actually through his entire story arc is mostly doing what is right. And almost like a new David, he never abandons the Lord. He dies as faithful as he was from the beginning of his tenureship as king. But one of the things he seeks to do in Israel to improve upon the lot that was given to him is he also sends teachers, Levites and priests, along with prophets, out into the land to face-to-face, door-to-door, teach everybody what it means to be obedient unto Yahweh. And there's a wonderful consequence that comes from this. The terror of the Lord was on all the kingdoms of the lands that surround Judah. And for the time of Jehoshaphat's reign as king, with the exception of the folly he allows himself to be drug into with Ahab and Ahab's son, which centers around wars, for the most part, Jehoshaphat is almost like a new Solomon in that he experiences tremendous amounts of rest. And God allows the people to prosper under him. As you said, or heard me say a second ago, the kingdom almost rivals that in landmass and holding with respect to Israel. In fact, even some of the Philistines brought gifts and silver as tribute to Jehoshaphat. The Arabs from the southern kingdoms brought flocks. So again, in every way, we are seeing that a resurrection or a revival of Solomon's wiser, better years over Israel comes all because of what Jehoshaphat did in centering around the focus on the wisdom of God, which brings us back to the words of Moses when he said, if you do this, you will be the head, not the tail, and you will move upward, never downward, if you listen to the Lord your God's commands I am giving you today. Josiah does the same thing, and granted, he winds up meeting a rather premature demise, but through this, he gets the assurance of the words of Huldah the prophetess that the calamity that is now irreversible, that awaits Israel on the horizon, namely the kingdom of Judah, he will not see in his days, but because of the fact he humbled himself before the Lord, which is exactly what Huldah says, humbled himself before the Lord, and by virtue of that seeks to bring the people back into this posture of humility and covenant faithfulness with the Lord, God rewards Josiah with a restful life, as brief as it will be. All right, so any questions? Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. I've got one more slide here. Real quick, I will just simply say, and we see this theme played out in so many other places. I won't touch on any of these here, but I want you teachers to know, should you get a hold of the slide deck, the reason why I put the verse passages on the left side in bold is because those are some texts that you will have to focus on in the Sundays that come ahead of you. So I call your attention to that here, especially with respect to the words of Psalm 119. One thing we often deal with is that very little emphasis or focus is placed on the wisdom of Torah, I will say in Baptist churches, because that's been my tradition all my life. And the reason why I say that is because not only are other Bible teachers out there touting that sort of thing, but for the most part, we almost kind of caricaturize the law, as if to say this is the means by which Israel tried to seek salvation through obedience to the law. But we fail to realize that grace is intertwined in all of that. It was not the law that rescued them from Egypt, it was grace. God showing up to deliver them by virtue of his mercy, visiting them in the day of their oppression. Then after that, he gives them this Torah instruction when he brings them to himself at his cosmic mountain, wanting them to follow him and then impact the nations. And that story is not let up on in the New Testament or our walk of faith with the Lord. And when you have the longest chapter in the Bible, which the psalm itself is not a chapter, it's a song, it's a poem. The longest song and poem, and again, chapter in the Bible, every single verse focuses on the word of the Lord, which is the Torah. It cannot be so easily divorced from our focus and attention as teachers. So anyway, with that, finally, any questions on the wisdom of God? Either I'm doing good or I'm doing terrible. I can't tell. Tough crowd. So anyway, we've got about 5 minutes. Go stretch your legs, get some water. And I've got 5:36 on the clock. So at 5:41, you don't have to be sitting down, but I'm going to start talking again. So see you again in a few minutes.
That is my question. I never want to
All right, so I forgot one thing to mention up front, and I guess I should have, is something of another disclaimer. I know this stuff comes hard and it comes fast. My teachers are a little bit more used to the fact that I have about a third more slides than I'm presenting now to jumble all this together. And the reason why is it's to give you food for thought. It's to give you a few things that hopefully stick to your brain, other things that you might miss, but that's part of the reason the resources are there available for you to peruse. Granted, they're not totally available right up front tonight, but they will be soon enough. That for you as teachers or students to go back and look at, and of course to enrich in your study as you're walking through this on your own, again, to prepare for lessons that you'll teach or personal moments of discipleship you'll share with family members at home or in other contexts. So now, Kingdom of God, which I would situate this here in the final unit that we'll have, or the third unit in this upcoming quarter, because this is where we start to broach toward the exile context and the fact that after the story arc is over with, we will see Israel firmly removed from both kingdoms through the Assyrians and Babylonians at various times. So when we look here, and what you're finding on the left side of the screen is a map of the kingdom under Saul. We recognize the fact that this is a theocratic kingdom in which God is ultimately king and seated at his right hand. And this is literal because we have Yahweh seated in his palatial palace or holdings of the temple where the footstool of his throne is, the Ark of the Covenant. And the palace complex to the right of that is where his son, the son of David, is seated right next to him and ruling as his visual representative to the people. And even though this is a theocratic state, yet what God is playing at and hoping to bring about, as goes the agenda for which this whole experiment was launched in the first place, was again, bring about what Eden and its occupants in the Genesis prologue was initially trying to do if they had not ventured into the context of chapter 3 and fallen as they did. Now we're seeing this played out in a much more exaggerated sense, as goes the larger diorama of David, Saul, and David, Solomon, and then ultimately the kings that play out after them. So with that, we remember the blessing mandate that was given to Adam, right? It is a blessing because God blessed them. That's what Moses tells us. But with that, there is a command to be fruitful and then to multiply, which means once they fill the garden and the garden cannot hold them anymore, that they don't just abandon the garden, but eventually as God's image bearers, endowed with the wisdom that they have, king and queen priest in that setting, that they are then given the option to expand the garden out, break down those barriers, move it farther out to create extra space for more occupants in there. That, while it fails in the Genesis story, is what's resurrected in God's call of Abraham. And of course, we have several hints of that given through the multiple contexts in which God speaks to Abraham, initially in Genesis 12, that all peoples will be blessed through him. Again, bringing Eden blessing to the world through Abraham's family. Genesis 17, when he says, I will make you extremely fruitful and I will multiply you, that's granted the fact that Abraham cannot do this himself because of the barrenness of his wife, but waiting expectantly upon God to bring this about for the sake of God being the one who receives glory and not Abraham, but ultimately tipping his hat toward what's supposed to be a resurrection of Adam's kingship through Abraham's line, and the fact that he will be the one who progenites multiple kings over multiple different nations. And of course, this is ultimately reiterated and finally ratified in Genesis 22 with the end of Abraham's story arc, when God, after he was supposed to offer Isaac, but then he's allowed to spare him, he says, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky, sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gates of their enemies. So that means there will supposedly come a time of conquest in the future in which Israel, when they are given this land of inheritance and promise to possess indefinitely, that they are going to, at some point, start expanding beyond the territory that God gave them as people begin to challenge them. And if they are walking faithfully with the Lord will deliver the gates of their enemies into their hands. The heart of the known world would be filled with Yahweh's people, because from the biblical perspective and vantage point, this is the crossroads of the ancient world. Everybody from either the European or Asian continents or Africa continents, if they want to travel by land into any of these other sectors, they're going to have to go past this peculiar people that worship the one God on his cosmic mountain. And the stated goal was quite clear, per Genesis 18. The reason why God chose Abraham was because he knew that Abraham would faithfully teach his children. Now, he does for the generation that he's alive to witness and see. But the idea is that this would perpetuate down through the line from Abraham to all generations of his children that would come after him, and that they, like Abraham, emulating the faith of their forefather, would walk faithfully with him. And we begin to see that to some extent with Saul's kingship, not because Saul is king. If anything, he is running the opposite direction. But now God has firmly planted them in the land, and the time has come for a king, even though it's not under the right circumstances, but God is going to take and do what he will with it in spite of that. And of course, in the days of David and Solomon, now that God's king from Judah, ruling on God's cosmic mountain in the new provincial Eden space, seeking to build new sacred space that resurrects, reimages, and repurposes the Garden of Eden. What I mean by that is the temple. We see the rest of the Eden mandate start to come to pass, such that by the time David is dead, he has already subdued just about every nation around them, with the exception of Egypt and the Hittites. Everybody else around them now either pay tribute to David and have a king that is, again, subservient to David, or no king, because David has removed that king from their throne and he rules over them directly. And then, of course, when Solomon takes over from David, rest has been given to this small empire that he has, and they start to bless the nations. They do this, again, emissaries coming in from all over the world, per the writer of Kings, to hear the wisdom that God has blessed Solomon with. And then the best example we get from that is 1 Kings 10, Queen of Sheba, a queen in her own right, wealthy and probably somewhat wise, but coming to God's cosmic mountain to hear God's king and, to some extent, priest, listen to what God has endowed him with, as goes the wisdom that drips from his lips like honey from a comb. She comes with the intent, if everything she expects plays out, to bless these people, and she does. When she sees the machinations of the palace, both the image bearer and God's palace work the way it does, and she hears the words of wisdom, sees the opulence and beauty of everything that surrounds her, truly takes her breath away. She blesses God's king. She blesses God's people. She blesses the God of Solomon and Abraham. And with that, per the words of Genesis 12, she in turn is blessed because Solomon gives her every desire of her heart, sends her away with just as much wealth as she brought to give to Solomon. And now she is all the more enriched by hearing the words that came from God's king priest, the wisdom that flowed from him. And all these emissaries are taking it to the nations. So in other words, what we have from the days of the judges to the days of Saul to the days of David and Solomon, and potentially beyond that, had they remained faithful, we're already seeing Israel check all the boxes of Genesis 12 and truly impact the nations in the way that God was intending through the seed of Abraham. But we know the story doesn't end there. Instead, what winds up happening in Solomon's own lifetime into the next generation after him, as we know what's coming, what was told to us today and what we're going to take up next week with respect to the kingdom fracturing. And slowly, incrementally, over the several centuries worth of generations of kings that come and go in both of these territories, eventually they'll start to lose land. It's not just the land that they possess on the eastern side of the Jordan River that was really never part of the land grant that God had given to Abraham and said that they would rule over. This is just the extra that has come from the quasi but mostly consistent obedience from guys like David and Solomon during his better years. But they eventually lose that and then start losing pieces of the land that were part of the original inheritance. We start to notice this in 1 Kings 11. They lose Aram because of Solomon's rebellion. God raises up an adversary, Rezon, and this guy challenges Solomon, and eventually he comes to reign over the kingdom of Aram, centered from the capital of Damascus. We're not sure exactly how he challenges Solomon, but within a very short period of time, after Solomon leaves the scene, the kingdom is fractured, Jeroboam becomes king, and a few generations later, maybe even under a different dynasty, certainly under the kingship of Omri and his son Ahab, the chief enemy of the northern kingdom of Israel is Aram, again, centered from Damascus, who we would call the Syrians. So they lose control over that territory. And again, all of this comes as part of the punishment for Solomon's apostasy that continues even in generations and dynasties of kings that are not of his lineage. And Aram begins to launch incursions into the kingdom space of Israel. We'll see this in 1 Kings 15, when a king by the name of Ben-Hadad comes to attack these cities that were cities outlined as part of Israel's tribal holdings in the books of Joshua and Deuteronomy. He attacks Ijon, Dan, Abel-Beth-Maachah, Al-Chinnereth, and the whole land of Naphtali. And it's lost. It's lost. They set garrisons up there. They start settling in the area. Israel will never regain this land. In fact, Ahab will try again and again, but he will fail. We'll go to 2 Kings chapter 10. In those days, we'll hear this terrible statement here, but this is a summary statement on the part of the writer of Kings to tell us this was indeed God's intended design and plan through all that's been going on in the reigns of these apostate kings in the north. That in those days the Lord began to reduce the size of Israel. Hazael, he is now king over Aram Damascus, defeated the Israelites throughout their territory from Jordan eastward. So everything from Jordan up to the Euphrates River now all belongs to them, at least until the Assyrians step up and take control. The whole land of Gilead, the Gadites, the Reubenites, the Manassites, the 2.5 tribes that took possession of land that was never granted to them in the days of Moses, but a blessing for what they had done in challenging the kingdoms of the Amorites, Sihon, Og, and whatnot. They lose all of this. So now it's not just the tribe of Naphtali, it's all the eastern tribes have lost their land. And again, Israel is shrinking. Why does this matter? Because they're supposed to be a kingdom of priests impacting the world. Really hard to do that, though, when all of your enemies on your borders seem to be encroaching a little bit more with every passing year. And of course, with that, we go back into the cycle of the judges. What I mean by that is it's not just the fact that somebody has come to town and say, you owe us money now or else we're going to come and beat you up. It's the fact they make their presence known through the tyranny they inflict. So every one of these people are coming to town to burn, loot, rape, pillage, and in every way that is chipping away at the dream of Eden that God had promised first through Moses, delivered by Solomon, and is again now being washed away in front of the very eyes. Moab grows bold. They rebel against the kingdom of Israel after Ahab's death, so they wind up losing control over that. And then ultimately what Nahum, and again teachers pay attention because this passage from Nahum will be something we will focus on as part of one of our lessons toward the end of the quarter. I'm against you, says God. And this is the declaration of the Lord of armies. I will lift up your skirts over your face and display your nakedness to the nations, your shame to kingdoms. I will throw filth on you and treat you with contempt, and I will make a spectacle of you. Why? Why shame Israel in such a way? Because what other prophets will go on to say, namely Ezekiel, you profaned my name amongst the nations. This is what you deserve. So in every sense, the kingdom that God had designed and envisioned and first gave to Abraham, as goes the visions that Abraham saw in Genesis 15 of his people suffering the oppression in Egypt, but then coming out of that victorious to a land that God is promising him that he currently dwells in. Pictured in the days of Joseph, when you've got an actual descendant of Abraham ruling as second in command over Egypt and blessing not only God's covenant people, Israel, small as they may be, but the nations that come to flock to Egypt for refuge, showing them this is what my idea of kingdom looks like, so that when you leave here, because I'm not leaving you planted here, when you leave here and you go to the place I promised your father Abraham, this is what I want this to look like. You blessing my people and blessing the nations. And if this works out well, there won't be a place where my name is not known under the sun. But that's not happening here. But even though we get a pretty sad story, again, before we bow out of this, there is a brief flicker of hope. And we have this in the personage of Josiah. Because at the beginning of his kingship, we have it in 2 Kings chapter 22, when he starts the process of renewing Israel, first by focusing on the temple and bringing it up to the code that it's supposed to be operating under. And they find the Bible in the church. He has the option then, standing before the trees, on what he's supposed to do. Because he's told by the prophetess that really it doesn't matter what he does from this moment on, nothing is going to assuage God's anger. In a sense, if you have aspirations to a bigger, better, brighter future, and you have someone tell you, it doesn't matter what you do, your dreams will never be realized, that's kind of a big blow to the stomach, right? It takes all the wind out of your sails. Most people with lesser fortitude would probably wind up packing it up and saying, well, I'm done then. But this doesn't deter him. Instead, it just fuels him all the more to be as obedient to Yahweh as he possibly can be. And in spite of the fact it might not make much of an intergenerational difference after this, yet he runs rampantly through Judah, and after he takes care of Judah, up into what was once Israel's territory and starts to clean house. And then he sees that Yahweh's presence is properly restored. God's throne presence is properly restored, because we have from the vantage point of the writer of 2 Kings in 2 Kings 35, he said to the Levites who taught all Israel the holy things of the Lord, put the holy ark in the temple built by Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Why is the ark not in the most holy place? Who took it out? How did they go up in there and grab the ark and not just immediately meet with God's punishment and die on the spot? What's going on here? Detail we'll never have. We'll never know. But what's important here is that, again, Josiah is in every way prefiguring, foreshadowing what Messiah is going to come to do when he steps on the scene. And in the earliest recorded gospel account that we have, the words of Mark, when he opens that account by saying the gospel of Jesus Christ, in verses 14 and 15, the time is fulfilled, or the time is at hand. Everything that's been written has been fulfilled. The kingdom of God is here. It's now. Repent, believe the good news. That's the announcement of the gospel. In other words, the concept of kingdom is really not even going to be broached again by Bible writers until Jesus steps on the scene and boldly proclaims this promise. So we need to help our students understand the concept that kingdom is slowly slipping away, but what is God's ultimate intent through kingdom? Not to just bless the ethnic descendants of Abraham. His concept of kingdom has always been, from the gates of Eden and the words promised to Abraham, the impact over the nations and everybody worshiping together as part of God's covenant people. And that's the mission and legacy we will find ourselves partaking in the New Testament, in spite of what happens through the rest of the events that we'll have recorded in these lessons. And that, perhaps, is probably the most important reason why this concept or focus of kingdom matters. So, any questions pertaining to this theme of kingdom? Pretty simple concept, I guess. Temple. I always try to remind us of this. The basic premise of temple is the ingredients required, right? That you have God, man, meeting together, sacred space. It doesn't matter if you've got wood walls that are ramshackled together through bars that keep them from falling apart, like the tabernacle, or beautifully crafted stone overlaid with cedar logs and gold and wall reliefs with cherubim and vines and so forth, or a simple garden with trees that drop fruit on the ground. Any of these things could be temple. John sees the whole city of Jerusalem coming down out of heaven in Revelation as a temple in and of itself, even though there's not one found there. But what we have here at play in the context of these stories we'll focus on, which I see this pretty much, is there a spot on there that I didn't highlight? I don't think so. But anyway, it pretty much fits into just about every lesson we're going to be talking about. If we remember very firmly and clearly that the theme of the tabernacle and temple is to reignite Eden, to revisualize what Eden was, and to bring Eden blessing through the gates of that complex, not only to God's people, as goes the covenant status they have and share with Him, but the nations, then we are operating on the right wavelength to see and appreciate all of this. But what sadly is going on here is that we have something I'm calling the Law of Diminishing Glory. Because first of all, we'll get the rivals of Jeroboam's cosmic mountain that he builds. One of the first things he does as soon as he becomes king is, I can't have this standing as a challenge to me here. This, of course, is going to undermine my authority. And so if the people are going back to Jerusalem and they are worshiping there, it's only a matter of time before they decide that's where their heart and loyalty and allegiance belongs to David's son, not me. Forget what God said, that if I follow him, he will bless me. So instead, does the sin of Aaron, makes the golden calves, 2 of them, that is, puts them at these particular shrines, and with that, like Aaron, immediately leads Israel into apostasy, right? He pronounces, here are your gods. Just as Aaron did, Jeroboam builds altars. Just as Aaron did, he pronounces a festive sacrifice to these particular images. But he's also doing the very thing that Micah from the book of Judges, an obscure story, but if we remember it, from Judges 17 through 18, we've got this guy, an Ephraimite, which is not coincidental, the fact that Jeroboam is also an Ephraimite. And if I can say as an aside, because I forgot to say this when we were talking about Jeroboam as something of a new Moses figure, it's not just that he's only a new Moses figure. In every way, he's almost like a new Joseph, a new Moses, a new David. Joseph in the sense that he comes from the tribe of Ephraim, And when we consider the idea that we once had the first picture of kingship over Israel in its proper method, in the way it's supposed to work, it was with an Ephraimite, Joseph. It was with the head of the house of Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph, before we ever have a pronouncement that a king is going to come through Judah. So in a sense, it's almost like we've got a son of David and a son of Joseph working in tandem to try to bring about the concept of kingdom. But sadly, this son of Joseph just runs in the opposite direction. And like another son of Joseph, this Micah of Ephraim, who decides, you know what? I think it's a little too inconvenient to go all the way to the tabernacle. Instead, I'll make my own little shrine. I'll take some gold or silver I stole from my mom, and I'll make an idol out of it, and I'll even make my son a priest. Jeroboam does the same thing. Shrines, idols, anybody and everybody except for the people of the house of Levi and Aaron can be priests. And so he goes in this direction. Or Ahab. Ahab has his own little cosmic mountain because Jeroboam does not have a capital city yet. He has to take one. And so he builds up Shechem. Eventually, the capital moves from Shechem to Tirzah. And then during the days of Omri and his son Ahab, they carve out the hill of Samaria. And they build a temple to Baal there. And when they do, it's going to be one that rivals, in every sense of the word, what the temple of Solomon was supposed to be doing in Jerusalem. But he adorns this temple much in the same way that Solomon will. And of course, we have the same mistakes being repeated with respect to Ahab marrying Jezebel of the Sidonians, which twists his heart all the more. Not to say Ahab's a stand-up guy, but the fact that Jezebel is the wife he chooses, and she allows him and empowers him to become exponentially more corrupt in his desire to want to worship other gods, namely her deity, that being Baal. It pollutes the land at an exponential rate. And of course, we see this with Solomon, right? After all, some of the women he loved were Sidonian. Ahab makes an Asherah pole. That's one of the things that Solomon crafts to, of course, bring about his apostasy. He sets up an altar for Baal in the temple. Again, Solomon high places even one across from the opening of the temple on the Mount of Olives in the land of Judah. Ahab did more to anger the Lord, God of Israel, than all the kings before him. It's not a coincidence the writer of Kings would say that again in the time of Ahab, because he's only repeating what he's already said of Solomon, that Solomon angered the Lord because, of course, he turned his heart away from him. So we have diminishing glory in the sense that with these rival worship sites, it gives the people the chance to apostatize at their whim. And I would even say, teachers, you should anchor this all the way back to what we've already discussed here. Don't be afraid to regurgitate stuff that we've already pulled from previous lessons. What I mean by that is today we were reading from 1 Kings 9. We might not have focused on this part of the chapter, but in 1 Kings 9 we are told this little obscure fact that Solomon, instead of kicking out all of these peoples, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, that Joshua and all of the descendants of Israel could not dispossess all the way up until the days of Solomon. Instead of deciding to finish that task with all the wisdom that God blessed him with, what does he do but act like a Pharaoh? I've got a free workforce here. I'll harness them. I'll oppress them, and I'll make them build everything. By leaving them in the land, though, when Israel fractures as a kingdom and now 10 tribes go to Jeroboam and he wants to apostatize, and later Ahab wants to continue this by setting up Baal as their chief deity, which the Canaanites, the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Itzites were already worshiping. So how easy it is for them to just turn right to the God that their ancestors for generations, all the way back as far as they can tell, to the beginning of time, had already been worshiping. Such a decision leads to the erosion and diminishing of the glory of what the temple and its centralized system of worship was supposed to do. I have Adam in quotations here because we're supposed to understand that every king that sits at the right hand of the Lord in his own palace complex, besides God's palace complex, is in a sense a new Adam. If we're understanding the imagery of the temple as being a new Eden, then the king is a new Adam figure. As often as Adam rebels, then we can see Eden being pillaged over and over again. Teachers, emphasize this to your students, please. Bart already talked about this a little bit this morning with respect to the invasion under Rehoboam of Shishak of Egypt. So that's one example that I give. But we have at least almost another 5 to round out a cool half dozen here of every time you see a king rebel and then God lambastes him either through a prophet or somebody else that draws this to his attention, or the writer of Kings just telling us this was a bad thing. Every one of the consequences that come from this are immediately drawn upon the temple. Because in every one of those boxes with red writing there, that's what you'll see. Just giving you the example here of Joash, because he's one king we will focus on, King Joash took all items consecrated by himself and by his ancestors, as well as all the gold found in the treasuries of the Lord's temple, and he sent them to King Hazael of Haram. But capture this. Of course, Bart was accurate this morning in saying that everything that had been stockpiled under David and Solomon that was either loosely able to be grabbed and carted off or could be easily stripped by some form of melting or whatever, perhaps carted off to Shishak. But for Joash to have a stockpile of gold and whatnot, they must have been able to have gotten more. God had blessed at interval periods of time in between the reigns of these particular kings. So while God allows for the prospect of blessing to creep back in, eating from the tree that they do, making the foolish decisions that they will, bringing about the consequences that ensue, what happens? Again, just as it was in the Genesis prologue, the blessings of Eden are lost. By the temple being pillaged, the blessings of the temple are lost. Or I should say the blessings of Eden. And of course, if that's the case, if Eden's being pillaged, then how is Eden blessing pouring to the nations? It's not. So any question there with respect to the temple? It's kind of a byword with respect to what we focus on in these stories, but it's all the more important to capture these times when every single time we've got a king in Judah messing up, a son of David not doing the right thing. It's the temple that winds up being the center point of focus. Or in a positive example, I'll just have to sum this up real quick. I thought about putting the slides in there, but it would have made it too long. But in some cases, like Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, even Joash for an extended period or a brief period of time, or Josiah, we have the focus placed on the temple for the sake of restoring and rebuilding, but ultimately it will be pillaged once again. So every time that these people are doing something, either positive or negative, we see Eden flourishing or Eden in some cases being ransacked. All right, priesthood. So we've got some highs and lows. Again, cased out for you in orange is the original ideal given to us from Genesis in the prologue of chapter 2, with God telling the man and the woman that they are to work, or avad, and guard, watch, or keep, shamar, the words in Hebrew, which are priestly terms given to us from Numbers 3 and 18, which tell us very keenly, once we read those texts, that what Adam was doing in the garden was not just planting seeds. He's guarding and watching what God is giving to him in the way of wisdom to share with the image bearers that will come after him. All that to say, when we get to Exodus 19, when God is reestablishing this Eden project, he's telling these people that have now come from Egypt, birthed out of that womb through the turmoil that ensued, and of course, ultimately the descendants and progeny of Abraham that or rival the stars in heaven in number, they are going to be commissioned as a kingdom of priests. Again, impact the world. We've got a few examples here. Guys like Jehoiada during the days of Joash. He rears a king from boyhood, literally adolescence, to follow and walk in the ways of Yahweh. And of course, for a time, he's administrating the king or the kingdom while the king is still very impressionable and young, and perhaps not really someone that many people would aspire to follow because of the fact he's a boy. But by virtue of that, he's able to steer the kingdom in the right direction, and through his time, regularly, every morning and evening, at least burnt offerings are being offered up. The ascension offering, in which Israel is consecrated anew to God at the beginning and end of every single day. And then, of course, we have examples of the teaching priests of the days of Jehoshaphat. We've already talked about that. Even the purifying priests of Hezekiah's day. And we see some of that play out in the times of other kings that have an effort or a revival movement to restore the temple. Usually, in most of those cases, there's going to be a need to repurify and reconsecrate the temple because of the apostasy that had gone on there before with, well, by the days of Josiah, they even have shrines that male cultic prostitutes are allowing people to come and worship in through what occurs there inside the temple precincts that has to be gotten rid of. And of course, you've got the priests and Passover of Josiah there. And again, he's not the only example of this. We have this with Hezekiah, but Josiah is a little bit special because what is said of him by the writers of both Kings and Chronicles is that no Passover had been celebrated like this since the days of Samuel. We're talking about hundreds of years before, right, in which this kind of observance had been seen. So we've got some high moments in which priests are faithfully dedicated and walking with the Lord and doing what is right, and not only observing cultic rite in the way that it's outlined by the words of Moses and Torah, but even the other mandate, which they are supposed to do as God told Aaron, your job is to teach people the difference between clean and unclean, holy and unholy. And then the Levites, you're guardians of God's word. You have to make sure that you teach and instruct the people as to what God says in his word. They do that at times. But we have as many negative examples too. We got Jeroboam's ban of Yahweh worship, right? And the consecration of a whole new class of priests that have no loyalty or allegiance to Yahweh. Ahab's priests to Baal, which we're never really told about how they come into formation, but when Jehu is anointed as king over Israel and he launches this campaign to bring about the judgment God promised on the house of Ahab and destroy everybody that had any affiliation with Ahab and everything that Ahab was about, which was the cult of Baal. Then we have a picture here of many of these, not only prophets in the days of Elijah, but also in the days of Jehu, priests of Baal being put to the sword. But that, of course, is predicated on the idea that not only was there priests to whatever it was that Jeroboam was leading the people to worship, but now priests who are dedicated themselves to being loyal and allegiant and obedient to Baal, not to Yahweh. Or perhaps some of the more egregious examples. You've got the high priest in the days of Ahaz, a son of David, a king over Judah, who when Ahaz goes to visit the king of Damascus and sees this grand altar, he makes a blueprint of this, sends it back with some messengers to Uriah and says, hey, when I get back to town, I want this thing built. And when he shows up and he sees the altar, he gives Uriah explicit instructions. You take the altar Solomon built and you move it to the side. And when I need a word from God, I will go and offer there, but nobody else can touch that altar but me. Everybody else will come and offer their burnt offerings that's supposed to belong to Yahweh on this profane altar. Everything, all the festivals and whatnot are going to be observed here. And whereas you have a priest who is willing to stand up and say to Uzziah in his days when he wants to burn incense, this is not for you. You don't get to do that. Challenge a king, even though it could have meant his head. Uriah is not willing to do that. And of course, it leads Israel into greater apostasy. And then you've got Pashur and Jeremiah. And Pashur is one of the priests ruling at the time when Jeremiah is serving as prophet. And here you have Jeremiah standing in the temple precincts telling everybody, listen, God is going to bring judgment. If you don't fix this and turn things around, God is going to bring judgment. You remember Shiloh? You remember what the Philistines did in their day when Eli was high priest and how God allowed the thing to be burned to the ground? I promise the same thing is going to happen here. But the high priest doesn't partner with the prophet in imaging God and saying, hey, we need to listen. Those were my people that suffered when the Philistines came and burned the tabernacle. No, instead he wants Jeremiah put in chains and thrown in prison. So all that to say, as Israel is supposed to be a kingdom of priests, this is why this matters. Because ultimately this means if the priesthood itself, the sons of Aaron, by the covenant that they have entered into with God, to be his priest, his visual representative between Israel and God, as much as Israel is a representation between God and the nations, they have basically bankrupted themselves and they are now defunct. And what the Bible writer is sowing into this throughout these successive movements on into the New Testament is that we have a call for multiple things, a call for a new priesthood. And so this is the New Testament line of thinking. So teachers, we need to grab this. Because when we get into the gospel writings, we are getting the announcement of a couple of things that are showing up that are cleansings of these things. Or I should say, not to just simply a repurposing, but a total rebranding of these things. A new temple, because Jesus makes the announcement in John chapter 2, hey, destroy this temple. 3 days from now, I'll raise it back up again. And John tells us he's talking about the temple of his body. And of course, as Bart for the last couple of Sundays has put up on the screen for us, 1 Corinthians 3, when Paul is telling us, hey, we are the temple of the Lord. The announcement of a new priesthood, right? I mean, in the first gospel that's given to us, Mark, although it's not first canonically, it's the first written by tradition, Jesus shows up in chapter 2 telling people their sins are forgiven. Who has the right in Israel to tell anybody their sins are forgiven? Yes, the Pharisees are right in pointing out God alone forgives sins. But God has also chosen to work with his human representatives in the class of the priests to tell people they are cleansed from their impurities. And sin and ceremonial impurity kind of go hand in hand when we're looking at the words of Moses in Torah. So they are the ones alone that have the prescriptive authority to say, you are clean, you are released from this bondage, and return back to fellowship with the community of God's people. So in Jesus doing that, he is taking on a priestly role by pronouncing people clean. And of course, man, I don't have time to say it, but we all know the writer of Hebrews is all over this. And then, of course, we have the announcement of a new ministry that's very priest-like in and of itself. After all, when Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians 5, in Christ, God is reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and he has committed the message of reconciliation to us. In other words, we are to bring people from their uncleanliness into covenant faithfulness with God. If that's not the role of the priest in Israel, then I don't know what is. If that was not the role of them being a kingdom of priests to the nations, I don't know what is. If we are harnessing this, then we can help our students understand this by sowing the seeds for this now, so that when we get into the New Testament, it's not altogether foreign to them. And it saves you, teachers, the burden of having to go back and re-explain all this stuff to them. You can touch on it. I would obviously encourage that. I'm going to take the effort to remind mine, because it's always good to reiterate these things, right? We can't hold it all together at any given time. But to not have to backtrack and explain all this, laying the bedrock of this theology now would be most helpful. And again, teachers, remember, our job in large part, considering from Ephesians chapter 4, this is just a little soapbox moment for me, we have an office in the church that we are to execute, but that is not the office of pastor. We work as an adjunct to them. So that means our job is to help enrich the congregation by virtue of our teaching efforts, but to not take the role of pastor. So in other words, our job isn't always to give pastoral application. Our job in large part is to help people understand how the Bible is put together and what the main thrust of the author's agenda and directive is in every successive book and letter, what they're striving to present as truth that props up the pastor's role in him being able to come in and just make the slam dunk and say those things. Give them tidbits of deep theology without having to feed it to them in spoonfuls. Some people he'll have to do that no matter what. But if we're propping up our students for success, it makes it all the more easier. Such that when our pastor makes a statement like, hey, so some scholars say that the temple is kind of reflective of Eden. We're all sitting there saying, yeah, we know that. Now give us something deeper. Come on, take us someplace we haven't been, right? That's what we're hoping to do. Lastly, we've got covenants before we end this thing out. So any question on priesthood before we move to covenants? Make sure I'm spanning everybody. All right. So this is where I think this would fit. Pretty much everything in the second and definitely everything in the third and final unit of this quarter. So I think what we have here is definitely a case being built for a new covenant. And what I have done here is try to orchestrate for you on this screen here, and I'm just going to give you a little spoiler. It's our last slide, so if you'll bear with me here, we'll be done. What I have here for you is on the top, some statement that seems to reflect in that blue box a covenant that God has made with a particular person who is mediating that covenant at the time. And then underneath the purple box, outlined for you in red, what the current state through the writings of either kings or various other prophets, namely Ezekiel and Jeremiah, the current state of Israel as goes the observance of this covenant. So the covenant of Adam was to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, right? And we've seen already a few brief hints. There are so many more that signify this is what God was working to do through Abraham and the nation he is going to build through him. The current state of this is what we've already seen in 2 Kings 10. That instead of being fruitful and multiplying in the days of Ahab and others that follow after him, God is systematically working to shrink down the size of Israel, not to multiply them. Why? Because again, Israel has basically, both Israel and slowly Judah, a little bit slower than Israel, is becoming something of a new Egypt. And they are allowing themselves to remain in the holds and throes of exile. And Israel can't stay in exile. They've got to come out of there. So even though we will look at the movement of the exile to or through Assyria and Babylon as being a moment of God's judgment, yet paradoxically, on the positive side of that, it's also an exodus. Because God is leading his people out of the Egypt that Israel and Judah has become to Babylon, to then a generation later turn them back around and bring them right back to Israel, but a renewed Israel under new leaders who are loyal to Yahweh and ultimately waiting expectantly for the age of Messiah to come. The covenant with Abraham. All nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring because you have obeyed my command. But yet Ezekiel says, then I had concern for my holy name, says the Lord, which the house of Israel profaned amongst the nations where they went. They're not being obedient. They're doing everything they can to besmirch the name and reputation of God. Covenant with Israel via Moses. Then all the people responded with a single voice. In Exodus 24, the marriage ceremony between Yahweh and his people, when the words of the law were read, what Moses got from the Lord, he gives to the people, and they say very clearly, as part of their wedding vows to him. Everything that the Lord has commanded, we will do. But what do we have Jeremiah saying? As for those who disobeyed, not keeping the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat them like the calf they cut in two in order to pass between its pieces. Invoking the story of Abraham in Genesis 15, right? When he's asking that question, how will I know that I will possess these things? And in that moment when he's cutting up these animals and putting their carcasses in halves to create the aisle that he and Yahweh will walk through, visually representing what so many covenant treaty ceremonies of the day was supposed to invoke. And the idea is faithfulness means blessing. Rebellion means what you see on the ground, blood and carnage. Jeremiah is predicting this very thing. Covenant with David, your house and kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. But then in 2 Kings 25, in the end of the days of the sons of David, they slaughtered Zedekiah's sons before his own eyes. And finally, the king of Babylon blinded Zedekiah, bound him in bronze chains, and took him to Babylon. The line of David, per the words of Isaiah, is nothing but a stump. The line of kings is done for. And the last of them is now a prisoner in exile who will not, like Manasseh before him, be restored to his throne. Permanently shamed, having now lost his sight, and the hope of future successive generations by his two sons being the last thing he saw before his eyes were put out when they were heinously murdered. So Israel and the nations, they desperately need a new covenant. And every one of these boxes are passages that are interspersed throughout our lessons that we will have to focus on. And in some way, shape, or form, they tie into the new covenant, right? I mean, here we have Jonah being told to get up, go to the great city of Nineveh, preach against it because their evil has come up before me. And we know what happens as a result of this. Nineveh repents. Why does God even send this guy there anyway? Because God's not done with the nations. Teachers, we have to make sure we connect that for our students. That whereas some may have a tendency to not necessarily see Israel as being charged with a mission to the nations, it's all about walking faithfully as a nation before Yahweh. This in every way, shape, and form shows that what God was doing through them was meant to impact the nations. And we have this brief little synopsis where one Israelite who ethnically and racially hates the Ninevites, but yet is called to preach to them because God's heart is for them as much as it is for the sons and daughters of Abraham, right? And that God seeks to one day establish a covenant, not like the one at Sinai that deals solely with the house of Israel, but a new covenant that deals with all the nations. Then, of course, when we have the words of Nahum, and same thing with Nineveh. But Paul in Romans, for though they knew God, they did not glorify him or as God or show him gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless and their senseless hearts were darkened. It's like there's not a lot of new covenant there. Yes, of course. But Paul is slowly building the case for what eventually he's going to unpack in Romans 7, 8, and 9. And maybe we'll have a time in our New Testament studies to touch on that. Although if my thinking is correct, I would say that by the time we get to the New Testament, we're not really going to get a lot of chance to focus on a lot of Romans, not as much as most of us as teachers would like. All that to say, teachers, be looking ahead, be preparing yourself. If you do not already know what the final layout for the last remaining quarter of the Old Testament or the 6 that deal with the New Testament is, Bart and Richard, I'm sure would be more than happy to supply you with that information so that you can be armed, you can know and reflect back on that as often as possible to prepare yourself. Don't assume that when we get to the New Testament, we're going to have a whole lot of time there, because if you've seen that schematic, we're going to be spending some time up front in John, then a little bit of time in Matthew, some very brief moments in Luke and John, or Mark to support this, and then about 3 whole semesters in the book of Acts, and jumping around here and there to spots in various epistles. And Romans is, in a sense, going to be something of a by thought or byword. It's not going to be somewhere we're going to spend a whole awful lot of time. So feel free then to take some very salient points from Paul's very prolific letter to them and even start introducing that theology now, all right? And then, of course, lastly, in Luke 10, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Which of these 3 do you think proved him to be a neighbor? The one who showed mercy, he said, right? And all of this is new covenant in thought because Jesus is trying to get this man to understand, as much as his heart is for the house of Israel and the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Again, heart is for the nations, and he is wielding a people who will follow him with that line of thinking. That ethnic divide and barrier that seems to have separated for generations has got to come tumbling down, because the first order of business after Jesus ascends unto heaven and turns the reins over to the apostles to continue his earthly mission is you've got to cross the aisle. You've got to cross the aisle. And whereas the former way of thinking under the old covenant would be we need to be separate, distinct, because these guys stink and they're going to pervert us, is we have to go and do more than shake hands with them. We've got to break bread with them. We've got to enter their homes. We've got to teach them what the love of God is all about. And the last thing that can enter our mind is whether or not they are Jew or Gentile, right? So, with that, any closing questions on covenants? Man, I don't know how I did that in 2 hours. I feel like it was terrible. All right, so a couple of resources there for you to look at. I do want to call your attention to this. I know our eyes can become a little bit hazed out to this because it looks like I throw up some sources that are there in every one of these, and some are. I really love going back to that book of reading Moses, seeing Jesus, even though it focuses mainly on Torah, yet there are so many things, as I try to bring out to you guys, that are rooted very firmly in Torah. But a few new resources. I would call your attention to the books on Dominion and Dynasty, Bound for the Promised Land. And even though we're already outside of Samuel, there are still a lot of good points from the book on the serpent in Samuel that shows the theme of the snake in Genesis 3 showing up at all these different stories inside the books of Samuel with respect to the kingships of Saul, David, and so forth. And of course, much of that theology continues to roll forward. So just some things to kind of help arm you with. And of course, some great podcasts to listen to as well that would definitely help you. The book, there is no book for this particular to go around. Instead, the one that you see in the center of the screen there, Rebels and Exiles, is the book I'd already chosen to teach with respect or be a resource for you last quarter, but it rolls ahead into this quarter. It only makes sense, right? Since we're going to be jumping all the way up to the end of the Old Testament narrative with respect to the exile. So some really good thematic points to draw out there. All right. That's it. So if you've thought of a question, you want to ask it out loud, pop a hand up. If not, I'm going to shut my mic off, and you're more than welcome to come up here and ask, and I'll stay for as long as anybody's got something